Welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce the co-moderator first, and then I will do some housekeeping things and like that. So my name is Sang Hun. I'm an injured worker and community organizer at IABIGO Community Legal Clinic. Also, we have John Lay. He's a co-moderator today with me, and I have Steve there as well. So, John, you want to say hi?
Hi, I'm John Ray. I'm a board member of Injured Workers Committee Legal Clinic and also second vice chair of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. And it's good to be here and working with you, and back to you.
Also, I want to see, how many people actually know about the Bancroft Institute. Is anybody been Bancroft session before? Okay, good, good. Okay, but I will just give you a little bit about like what is Bancroft Institute and what session is about today. So the session the session today will explore the strategy and background of the raising workers' compensation issue under international human rights law, and will future legal expert, academia, injured worker, disability right activists, and more here today. Um, Also, the Bancroft Institute for Study on Workers' Compensation and Work Injury is an impressive name for a small, unfunded volunteer group of researchers, injured workers, and advocates. But it's not very. It is very rewarding work. Uh, Great turnout here today. It's wonderful to see many different people here. And I also want to see who is here in the room as well. Is there any people who come from academia or researcher here today? Okay. And is there any injured worker here today? Great. Okay. Is there any people doing the case work or the legal work at the community legal community and other one? Okay. Is there any people from government here? No. Any employer? No. Okay. Good. So I thought so. Okay.
Actually,
Okay.
that's too bad.
All right. Then, John, do you want to add anything else? That's good enough.
Don't forget laborers here too.
Laborers, yes. Unions, yes. Good. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's pretty much for introduction. I just want to pass to John Lay. You can start the first panel discussion. John, you want to take over?
Thank you. Let me add my welcome to everybody, both here in the room and who are listening online. I look forward to this afternoon. I have an easy job today because all I have to do is moderate this first panel, and I've got three wonderful speakers who are going to do the bulk of the work for me. So my job is a pleasurable one and an easy one. And I'm also part of the organizing group with the Bancroft Institute, so I'm pleased to have been asked to co-facilitate this afternoon. So the first panel has three speakers. Two of them are online and one is here in the room. So our three panelists are Steve Estey, who is, I assume, in Nova Scotia, and online. Steve, are you there? No?
Shaking his head, yes.
He's not.
Is he okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, John. Yeah, I'm here. I was just unmuting myself.
Good. Steve is well recognized for his work on the UN Convention, both as it was being formulated, because he was part of the Canadian delegation, and since the convention was adopted, he's done extensive work and is well recognized, and rightfully so, for his work trying to educate Canadians on what the convention provides. Carrie Joff, a lawyer with Arch Disability Law Center, she joined Arch in 2007 and has been involved extensively in litigation and law reform work, litigating at various levels, tribunals, and as high as the Supreme Court of Canada. And so, welcome. And Professor Jeffrey Hilgard from the University of Montreal is here with us. And among other things, in his distinguished career, was very important in helping ONIWIC with its submission in 2019, I think it was, to the United Nations concerning an issue that is critical to all injured workers, that being deeming and the issue of phantom jobs that continues to hurt many, many injured workers. So, welcome, panel, to this session. We have about an hour and a quarter, so I'm suggesting if each of you could take about 20 minutes. After that, we have set aside 20 minutes for questions, comments, whatever, from those of you who are here in the room or online. So, without further ado, Steve Estey, over to you.
Let me just start by thanking you all for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I think I can trace it back to probably about 2015 when your colleague Steve Mantis, who I believe is in the room there, participated in a meeting that we organized to begin a work around reporting on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It was at that time that civil society groups were coming together, and injured workers wanted to be part of that discussion. So Steve came to a discussion that we had in Ottawa, I think in December of that year, and we've worked with Steve and other injured worker representatives over the course of the time since then to try to integrate the perspective of injured workers into the reporting process. So we'll talk about that over the course of the afternoon here. But my job, as I understand it, is to sort of set the stage around this, because we wanted to talk about sort of the international human rights law framework and how the Disability Convention fits into that and what that means for Canada and so on. As I say, the first slide, I just want to talk about how the convention came to be and how it fits into the human rights structure and what it means for Canada and potentially for injured workers here. So here's the outline of what I want to talk about. Those of you who've heard me talk about the convention before may want to go and read a book or something, because it's the same story that I've told in many places, in many other rooms, because the story doesn't change, but it's a matter of trying to get the word out. And as John said, it's something that I've been involved with for a long time. So I want to talk about disability at the UN over 60 years and how it kind of evolved over a long period of time. I want to talk about the drafting of the treaty, and I want to talk about the fact that Canada has ratified it and what it means for us. So really, the story of the CRPD begins with the founding of the United Nations after the Second World War, and I mean, I think people are generally well aware that after the two European wars in the early part of the 20th century, there was a real fatigue around that kind of relationship or lack of relationship between nations. And after the failure of the League of Nations after the First World War, countries came together after the Second World War and again tried to put things together, and this time it did so in the form of the United Nations. They agreed to come together in the United Nations to work to try to avoid the kinds of sets of circumstances that had led to the Second World War and all the things related to that. So in the early days, that meant coming together to talk about kind of foundational principles and so on. And one of the first documents, a foundational document that came from the United Nations, is a thing called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that, interestingly enough, was the drafting of that was done by a Canadian lawyer, whose name is escaping me right now, but trust me, it was a Canadian lawyer. Gary, you want to jump in? Unmute yourself.
Wasn't it John Peter Humphrey?
Yeah, it was Humphrey.
John Holmes, yes. Okay, so this is the tag team PowerPoint presentation now. Thank you, Gary. Anyway, John Holmes was a Canadian lawyer working in foreign affairs after the Second World War, and he was tasked to do the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that happened, and countries came together to discuss and debate this Universal Declaration, and it basically talked about the kinds of things that human beings needed to have in order to live free, respectful, and harmonious lives. They talked about the right to fair wages, the right to work, the right to participate in government, the right to freedom, eligibility to vote, security, all of these things, which are the kind of basic things that you need. We put together a whole highfalutin language around that since 1948, but basically human rights are these things, the right to have a job, the right to go to church, the right to go to the hospital. That's what human rights are all about. So that's the Universal Declaration that came out in 1948. So after 48, countries in the UN began talking about the fact that it's great to have this overarching document about the Universal Declaration, but they needed to have some more specifics about what those things meant. And it led to the drafting of two different documents at roughly the same time, but in two separate processes in the UN. One is the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And I've got a slide up here on the screen for folks who can't see. It says that the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and it talks about the International Covenant, and it notes that it was adopted by the General Assembly in 1966 and entered into force in 1976. And I've got kind of a quirky little cartoon that's here as well. And the reason I put that cartoon there is because that cartoon was created during the Disability Convention time by an Israeli animation guy who was a person with a disability. So it just seemed like a really great kind of merging of economic, social, and cultural rights and disability and things. So that's a picture that's part of a movie that he did called 39 Pounds of Love. You may be able to find it on YouTube after the session today. I don't know. The other covenant is a covenant on civil and political rights. And this one was adopted again in 66 and entered into force roughly in about 1976. So roughly at the same time as the other covenant. So you've got these two covenants, one on economic, social, and cultural rights, the other on civil and political rights. And I kind of, in a shorthand in my mind, think about these as a kind of covenant on positive and negative rights. So the covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, in my head at least, when I think about this, is about things that governments ought to do to ensure equal participation and respect for people in their country. So they ought to provide education, they ought to provide health care, all of those kinds of things. Where the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights talks more about things that governments ought not to do. Things like they ought not to lock you up, they ought not to deprive you of your right to vote, they ought not to deprive you of your right to move around freely in the country and things like that. These documents together are referred to many times as the International Bill of Human Rights. So the three things together kind of form the bedrock of international human rights law, the International Bill of Human Rights, which is the Universal Declaration, and the two covenants on positive and negative rights. So let's move forward from there to the next slide. So I said to you that these covenants, the civil and political and economic social covenants, were drafted by the mid-60s. And after that, there began to be a process in the UN system around the development of thematic treaties. And there are 4 thematic treaties that emerged over the course of the next number of years. That information is all up on the slide, so I'm not going to bother to read that. But the point of it is that in the UN system, they recognized that these covenants were good and important things, but there were groups and cohorts in society that needed specific attention paid in order for them to be able to realize their rights. So there were covenants or conventions, rather, on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Then there was a convention a number of years later on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. That was adopted in 1979. Then there was a convention on the rights of the child that was adopted in 1989 and entered into force in 1990. Also in these treaties, they talk about the Convention Against Torture, because in the Human Rights Convention as well, it doesn't focus on a specific group, but it's a kind of a thematic in terms of keeping people free from torture and abuse and those kinds of things. So that then gives you kind of the big picture of international human rights law in the UN system from 1948 to 1990. Somewhere, yeah, in the 1990s. So I want to sort of park that information for a second, or for a couple of minutes, and talk now about what was happening in the UN system around disability at the same time. This next slide, there's a picture of a banner that we created at the beginning of the UN Convention, Disability Convention process, and the poster just has the word disability on one side, and then it has convention, yes, across the middle of it in big white letters. So we'll come back to that. I'll get to that. I haven't got to the convention yet. But let's go to the next slide and talk about what happened in disability in the UN over the years. I'm just watching my time here and thinking I should pick up on things, give Carrie lots of space and time for her presentation. So let me do that and say that I look at this in three blocks of disability stuff in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the UN system. In the 1970s, what you see here, and I'll just go quickly through these things, the first instance of reference to disability that I've been able to see in the UN system was in 1971, when the General Assembly adopted a Declaration on the Rights of Mentally Retarded People, as they called them at the time, and that declaration promoted community living where possible. So I've got that where possible in big red letters, because it's a big trap door that kind of said where possible, so governments can say, well, it's not possible, so we're not going to do it. But at least at the beginning of a discussion. After that, in 75, the General Assembly adopted a Declaration on the Rights of People with Disabilities that promoted their participation in civil and political rights. Again, it wasn't a binding thing. But in 76, there was more discussion about the UN and disability, and they decided to declare the 1981 the International Year of People with Disabilities, which is things that you're probably aware of. I mean, the UN adopts years on all kinds of different things. So 1981 was the International Year of People with Disabilities. Then in 1977, they set up a trust fund to support the work of that year. And I always like to point this out, because that trust fund that was set up in 1977, between 77 and 81, with all 186 countries in the UN at the time, we were able to raise a whopping $510,000. So I think it's really indicative of where UN and disability were, and disability way on the margins of things at that time. So in 1981, as I say, they declared the International Year of People with Disabilities. The thing that's interesting about this is that at the end of that, as a follow-up in 1982, the UN adopted a world program of action, and they declared a decade of people with disabilities. So, I mean, it's a kind of a standard UN process, you know? You kind of one-up yourself. You say, the year is so good, we'll make it a decade and we'll go from there. But the interesting thing that happens is that when you set up a decade, there are certain UN mechanisms that come into play here. And the first mechanism was the 1987 mid-decade review. And they brought together disability experts in Italy in 1987 to talk about the implementation and the success of the decade. And if you recall back, it was during those times that we had these thematic treaties happening. So the disability community looked at those thematic treaties and said in 1987, we should have a disability convention. So the government of Italy, as a host to that meeting, took the idea to the UN General Assembly, but they weren't able to get support for it. So it didn't go anywhere. But at the end of the decade meeting in 1989, Sweden held a similar review conference, and again there was a call for a convention. Swedes took this to the UN. They weren't successful, but the Swedes did something that hadn't been done before. They said, well, we need to do something, and they went off and they developed a thing called the UN Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunity for People with Disabilities, or the Standard Rules in shorthand. That became the discussion in the 1990s. So let's go to that, okay? So 1993, the UN adopts the standard rules that I talked about. And these standard rules were very useful things in terms of how countries could ensure the equalization of people with disabilities, equalization of opportunities. But they weren't binding in any way. They were just a bunch of suggestions that came from the UN. So it was hard to enforce them. The Swedes did something to try to support this, and they appointed a special rapporteur on the standard rules. But actually, there was somebody before Ben Lindqvist, but in 1994, Ben Lindqvist, a Swedish parliamentarian, became the UN Special Rapporteur on the Standard Rules, and Bengt worked for almost a decade to try to advance the Standard Rules. A significant thing in UN speak happened in 1998 when the UN Commission on Human Rights passed a resolution called or entitled UN Human Rights for People with Disabilities, and it acknowledged the general responsibility for the UN of people with disabilities. The first time you see any reference or connection to disability and human rights in the UN, and that's very important. After that, in 1998, there began to be more of a push again for a convention. And countries were looking at different ways of doing it. So we entered into a period from 1998 until 2000, 2001 of trying to push this. In 2001, there was an anti-racism conference in Durban, South Africa. And at that anti-racism conference, the government of Mexico, which had a new president at the time, Vincent Fox, was looking to advance the Mexican name in areas of human rights because they were having problems, as you may recall, domestically with Chiapas Indians and so on. So they were concerned about that, and they were trying to find ways to make their image better in human rights. So they advanced this resolution at the Durban Anti-Racism South Africa Conference to talk about a resolution to the General Assembly to consider setting up a committee to study whether or not there should be a convention on human rights. Let's hang on a second. So that from Durban in the summer of 2001 to December of 2001 went to the General Assembly, and the Mexicans moved this resolution. And the General Assembly had a debate about this, and they did what the General Assembly usually does in this. They heard a discussion about setting up a committee, and they said, well, it's a committee. We have committees for all kinds of things, so it must be a good thing to do. So they endorsed the Mexican resolution, and they created a committee to move things forward. Let's go forward. So that Mexican resolution led to the creation of the Ad HOC Committee. This Ad HOC Committee is, as John said, something that I participated in between 2002 and 2006. The book get into a lot of details about it. I mean, kind of boring drafting process and stuff. But I mean, what happened basically was the committee met annually and sometimes more often in New York. There was a very weak beginning around this, where a few countries came together to talk about whether or not there should be a convention. A lot of countries were pushing against it. They didn't want to have a convention at all. Canada in those days was among the countries that wasn't interested in a convention. They talked about treaty fatigue and having too many other UN responsibilities and that kind of thing. They felt also that people with disabilities were covered by already existing conventions. But at the end of the day, we were able to overcome those barriers, and we moved forward in 2003, 2004 to begin the work of drafting a convention, and the work of significantly drafting a convention. And in January of 2004, our working group met to come up with the first draft of the convention. That working group had 40 delegations, 26 government delegations, 12 NGO delegations, and one National Human Rights delegation. I was on the delegation for Disabled Peoples International at that time, participated in the first draft of things. We went from there to refining the convention over a number of meetings to improve the text of the convention and so on. So finally, in August of 2006, we had a convention, we had a treaty that people were able to come together and endorse. So the Ad HOC Committee brought this treaty back to the General Assembly, and in December of 2006, the General Assembly agreed, endorsed, or I'm blanking on the word, but they adopted the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and opened it for signature in March of 2007. This is a picture of myself along with colleague Dulcie McCollum, who is also an NGO representative at the Ad HOC Committee from Canada, along with Canada's ambassador to the United Nations at the time, John McNee, and he's actually signing Canada's name to the CRPD. That happened in 2007, and then from 2007 until 2010, we went through a big process of trying to get the Conservative government to actually ratify the convention. That did happen finally in 2010. Yeah, March 11th, 2010. So that's actually a year, 10 years ago, yesterday, I think, we ratified the convention. So we've been working for 10 years. Let's go to the next slide. I'm just about done here, but I want to say to you generally, for our purposes or for your purposes, that the convention sets up a few mechanisms that are important as you try to move your injured workers agenda forward. First of all, it establishes a committee that hears regular reports on how countries are implementing or realizing the rights of people with disabilities. So we did submit a report in 2013, and as I said to you, Canada submitted a report, a first report, in 2013, and in 2015, civil society came together to begin the process of drafting a parallel or shadow report. And that's when Steve Mantis and injured workers began to get involved in this process. And there was some discussion about injured workers in the first parallel report that happened in the UN went through that in 2016, 2017. There were concluding observations that happened in 2017. I think others would be better able to discuss exactly what happened with reference to injured workers in those reports. But the thing to point out to you now is that we're just beginning the process, and Steve and others have begun to feed into the process of the second round of reporting that is beginning to happen. We met in May of this year to begin to feed into the second round of reporting, and we created a list of issues prior to reporting that has gone to the UN, and there is now a document that has come out from the CRPD committee, came out in September of last year, that's called the list of issues prior to reporting, and that's how we need to engage on this in the broader community. Carrie and I are going to be facilitating another online meeting next week, and injured workers folks I'm hoping are going to be participating in that. Certainly been invited to it, and happy to follow up afterwards. But we're beginning the process of drafting the parallel report on the second convention. So I don't want to talk anymore about that. I think I've taken my time and maybe a little bit more. If that's the case, I apologize. But I just wanted to give you that kind of background so that you have a sense of, this report that we want to talk about next week didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It has a very long and organic history that fits into international human rights law, and there's an awful lot of substance behind it. So there you go. I'm going to pass it over to John, and we're happy to talk about questions. Okay, thanks. I have all the stuff that I just said is on slide there. I get carried away at the end trying to get things finished up. Sorry about that. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that and be happy to entertain questions if you have them at the end. Thanks very kindly for your attention.
Thank you very much, Steve. I've heard you speak on the convention many times, but never this comprehensive timeline that shows how the UN started and the development of various treaties and conventions. Since I have the mic, I can't help but make one observation, and that is these conventions sound great. I just wish we had all of the rights that they say we're supposed to have, whether internationally or domestically. So thanks again, Steve, for that wonderful presentation.